Today's daf yomi is Nazir daf Lamed, Nazir 30. And we're going to start at the bottom of Chavtes and Beis, where the Gemara has told us about an incident where Rabbi Hanina, whose father told him that he was a Nazir. He took a vow that Rabbi Hanina is someone being Nazir. And they brought him in front of Rabbi Gamliel to see whether or not he really was a Nazir. So at that point, Rabbi Gamliel Bodko. Hold on one second. So Gamliel was checking him to see whether or not Laida Im Hevish Saros Im Loavi. So there are two versions of the story. The first version was that Rabbi Gamliel was checking him to see whether or not he had brought forth the two hairs, which are the signs of manhood, or whether he didn't. And Rabbi Yossi's version of the story was that Rabbi Gamliel was checking him to see whether or not he had reached the age of understanding that he can make a vow, which was 1 year prior to being 13. So, and then Rabbi Hanina said, as a young boy, he said, "Don't bother checking me." He said, "Listen, if I'm a minor, my father made me a Nazir, and if I'm an adult, then I'll be a Nazir on my own." And then Rabbi Gamliel kissed him on his head, and it wasn't long before Rabbi Hanina became a great teacher in Israel. So the Gemara says, Bishlama makes sense. We're now on 29b, 5 lines from the bottom. It says, Bishlama Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. It makes sense according to Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, who says, and the Gemara is assuming here that the way we have to understand this question, and it's a very simple question, it's really set up for the next question, but the way we have to understand it is that the boy was under the age of 12. So it makes sense. The Gemara wants to connect this with an earlier dispute between Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. So it makes sense according to between an earlier dispute between Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda and Rabbi. The Gemara is going to connect this to an earlier dispute. So the Gemara says it makes sense according to Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, who says that the father can make his son a Nazir. So it makes sense according to Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, who says that the father can make him a Nazir until he reaches the age of understanding. That's why it states Im Katan Ani Eyev B'Shvil Abba. That's why, according to this version, Rabbi Yossi, that's what he's saying. Rabbi Hanina is saying, if I'm a minor, I'm going to be a Nazir on account of my father. So because he was under the age of Onas Nadarim. Rabbi the Amar, he was under the age of 12. Rabbi the Amar Achi Yavishtei Sairos. But according to Rebbe, who says that he's going to be, according to Rebbe, who says he's going to be that his father can make a vow until he brings forth two hairs. But why can he say if I'm an adult I'll be a Nazirite on my own? He still hasn't put forth the two hairs yet. According to Rebbe, who says that he needs to have the two hairs, so he's still going to be, even if he's reached the age of understanding, he's still in the domain of his father. So Gemara gives the obvious answer. So the Gemara says, no, that what's really going on is, according to Rebbe, he's not saying if I'm a minor or if I'm an adult, but with respect to vows, but rather he's saying with respect to the two hairs. He's saying, if I'm if I don't have the two hairs, I'll be a Nazir from my father. And if I have the two hairs, me. So then the Gemara asks the next question, which is really, the first question is really so obvious. It was just a setup for the second question. Second question says, so it says, makes sense according to the Tanakama of this Brisa, who says it makes sense according to Rebbe, who says that it's all dependent upon whether or not he has the two hairs. So that it makes sense. Therefore, the Gemara says, since according to Rebbe, the way we understand Rebbe Hanina is saying, he's saying if I have two hairs, I'm a Nazirite for my father. And if I don't have two hairs, I'm a Nazirite for my father. If I have two hairs, I'm a Nazirite for myself. And so therefore, that makes sense because if he has two hairs from the beginning, then he's going to bring the carbon from himself. And so therefore, if he had the hairs from the beginning, delay. He has his own Nazirus. And if he has the two Cyrus at the end, then it's his father's carbon, it's his father's Nazirus. And so he'd also and so therefore he'd also bring the Nazirus because it's very clear that he's a Nazir. But let's say he gets the two hairs in the middle, then what's going to be the case? So under those circumstances, how can he bring the carbon at the end of Nazirus? Was it from himself or was it from his father? Because in the middle of the Nazirus, his father's Nazirus would have been canceled because his father can make when his father made his son a Nazir, it became nullified when he became an adult. So therefore, why does Rabbi Hanina say to Rabbi Gamliel, you don't need to check me because either way, I'll bring a Nazir. But what if he became a Nazir in the middle? A very complicated question. So the Gemara says, it makes sense according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, who says until he reaches the age of making a vow. That makes sense. Meaning to say that we don't have the concern because it's really not a precise time. So therefore, of when he reached the age of making a vow. And so therefore, will become a Nazirite in the middle. So we would assume that he's still going to end the Nazirus of his father. But according to Rebbe, who says, according to Rebbe, who says, until he brings forth the two hairs, meaning to say, until such time as he's an adult, until he brings forth two hairs, he's going to be under the Nazir. So his father, what would be the case where he brings in Nazir, where it gets the two hairs in the middle? Michael Maimer. So Amir Rabbi, so according to Rabbi, the Gemara says if he would have Nazir, if he would get the two hairs in the middle, there's no way out of it. He'd have to sit under his own Nazirus first, and then do another 30 days for his father, and then when he could bring the carbon, because then we know for sure that he was really having two sets of Nazirus. Okay, meaning to say not two sets of Nazirus, and for sure we would know that he was either a Nazir from himself or from his father, and that's how it would for sure be okay. So now we're up to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ha'ish Megaleach on Nazirus Aviv. So there's actually, with this Mishnah, there's a lot of technical Girsa questions, which actually reverse the whole reading of the Mishnah. So we'll adopt the different Girsa as proposed by Tosfos. So the halacha is a man can sometimes bring the karbanos that his father had set aside. But a woman cannot use the karbanos that her father had set aside to be a Nazir. We know at the end of your Nazirus, you have to bring forth 3 karbanos, an olah, a shlomim, and a chatas. So a man can sometimes use his father's karbanos, but a woman cannot use her father's karbanos. Kate said, what's the scenario we're talking about? So the Tosfos change is it Misha Hayahuva Viv Nazirim. So if both he and the father were Nazirites, Behifrish Mo Stumim on the Ziruso, and he set aside money for his Nazirus. He didn't say for which carbon it was going, but he took this lump sum of money for the Nazirus, Umeis, and then the father died. And then the son comes along. So then Amar Rabbi Yossi, again, we're adopting Tosfos' version of the text. And under these circumstances, Amar Rabbi Yossi, under those circumstances, we're going to say that this money goes to Nadava, because this is the case where you have a Nazir who dies, and the money was to Sumim. So then the money is going to go for a voluntary offering. But in this case, the son cannot take the haircut, use the karbanos on the basis of the Nazirus of his father. And what's the reason? Because he was already a Nazirite while his father was alive. And so since both of them were obligated to bring the karbanos, in this case, we don't have the special halacha that you could use the karbanos of your father. Ve'ezu shemegaleach Nazirus aviv. But when do we say that a Nazirite can use the karbanos of his father? Only in this circumstance, Arishaya Aviv Nazir, where his father was a Nazir, and he set aside money, but he didn't specify it. Umeis, and then the father dies, and then Amar Hareini Nazir Amanash Agaleach Amos Abba, and then the son says, "I'll be a Nazirite on the condition that I can bring the karbanos of my father." So then we're going to say, under those circumstances, in this case, the son can bring the karbanos of his father. This is the girsa. This is the text of Tosfos and the Rosh because it matches the Gemara on Amud Beis, and the Rosh says that this is the most logical way to read the text of our Mishnah. So the Gemara says, "My timer. What's the reason that a son is a?" And here also we have completely opposite ways to read this discussion. But we'll go with the reading of Tosfos here. My timer. What's the reason that man can bring the karbanos from the naziris of his father, but a woman cannot bring the karbanos from the naziris of his father? Rabbi Yochanan says it's halacha Moshe Misina, halacha ibn Nazir. It's just a straight halacha from Moshe was saying that. So the Gemara says, well, pshita. Well, it's obvious. So what's obvious? Ma'ala Meimer, why do you need to say it's halacha Moshe Misina that a woman cannot bring karbanos from the naziris of his father? Ben Yoreshus Avinu Baslo. It's obvious that the son is going to be able to do it, but not the daughter. So the Gemara says, no. Now we're talking about a case where the man only has a daughter and no son. So Ma'u Detema, you might have said Yorshin Gemiran. You might have said that the heirs under this case that the halacha is Moshe Sinai that who can bring the karbanos of their father? Anybody who's an heir. And in this case, the daughter is the heir. And so therefore, if there's no son to be the heir, you might have thought the daughter can do it. Kamash Malan halacha. So we say on top of Amud on the base, no, it's halacha Moshe Sinai that the son can do it and not the daughter. So the Gemara says, Ibalu. Gemara asks the question, and this is one of the reasons. So the Gemara says the following question: So our Mishnah only has the version of Rabbi Yossi. So what do the Rabbanan say? It's Rabbi Yossi's minority opinion. So do the rabbis argue with Rabbi Yossi? Is Rabbi Yossi a minority opinion or is he not? So the Gemara says, Do the rabbis argue with Rabbi Yossi or do they not argue? Again, what did Rabbi Yossi say? Rabbi Yossi said that if the father dies and the son is not yet a Nazir, and the son is a Nazir, then the money goes to Nadava. But if the son was a Nazir, then the son can bring the karbanos of his father. So the rabbis argue with Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara wants to know, do the Rabbanan argue with him or not? And if we want to say pligi, even we want to say that the rabbis argue with him, yes, the Gemara Nazir. You want to say if the rabbis say that they do argue with him, if you want to say that the Chachamim argue with Rabbi Yossi, we need to say under what circumstance are they arguing? Do we say Aresha or a Seifa? Are they arguing with him on the Resha or in the Seifa? Are they arguing on the first clause where Rabbi Yossi says that if the son was a Nazir while his father was alive and the father set aside money and then died, the money goes to Midava? Or are they arguing with him on the Seifa? What does the Seifa say? That the second clause says that if the son was not a Nazir when his father died, that he's able to take that money and use the karbanos for his own. So the Gemara wants to know: do the Rabbanan argue with Rabbi Yossi on both on the Reisha or on the Seifa? So the Gemara says, well, let's look at this case. Tashma, Keitzad. So the Gemara says, let's cite a brisa. Amru, and this is why Tosfos and Rosh have this different gear. So they say Amru. That what does the text say? The text says, "Ha'ish megalech naziros aviv." A son can use the karbanos of his father when it comes to Nazirus. Mishaya Aviv Nazir, Yifrish Aviv Malos Nazirus. So let's say the father was a Mishaya Aviv Nazir. Let's say the father was a Nazirite. V'hifresh Aviv Malos Nazirus. So when the father set aside money for his Nazirus, and then he died. V'amar Hareini Nazir Amanashe Galeach Amos Abba, and then he says, I'm going to become a Nazirite on the condition that I could use my father's karbanos. This is the case where he can use the karbanos from the money of his father. Or in Lamanam Abayz. But if both he and the father were Nazirites, and the father set aside money for his Nazirus, and then the father died. All right, then under those circumstances, the money goes to Nidava. That's the position of Rabbi Yossi, whereas Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, they're more inclusive. They say, no, even in that case, these Rabbanan say, even in that case, the son can use the father's money, even in a case where the son was already a Nazir, he can use that money for his own karbanos. So they're more inclusive. The Rabbanan are more inclusive. So the Gemara says, So the Gemara says as follows. By Rava asks, the Gemara is going to ask a series of questions. Let's say a person has two sons who are Nazirites. What's going to be the halacha there? Do we say Hilchasa Gemirin? Let's say he has two sons who are Nazirites. Are we going to say it's halacha Moshe Misina? I called the Kadim Galach, Odelma, Yerusha Gemirin and Upalge Have. Do we say, if let's say the father has two sons and he left aside, let's say $1,000 for the karbanos, do we say whoever gets it first, got it first and he used the karbanos? Or do we say, no, it's an inheritance and they have to split it? So by Rava asks another question. B'chor Pasha, let's say one of them was a firstborn and one of them was a regular child, not a firstborn. What's the halacha? So do we say, Hilchasa Gemirin Allah, Vilkach by Giluche, so do we say under these circumstances that it's not like a regular inheritance, it's halacha specific for Nazir, that a son can use the karbanos of his father, and so therefore the law of a firstborn, where he typically gets a double portion, does not apply in this case, and so therefore he doesn't get double. We're not going to say that the laws of the karbanos here go according to what he could take. Odelma Yerusha, or you say it's a straight halacha, and so therefore, just like in general, he gets a double portion, here too also he's going to get a double portion. And if you want to say that really it's inheritance, he gets a double portion. And according to what he takes, he brings he gets and if you want to say that it is a Yerusha, meaning to say that and it is like the laws of an inheritance, that and therefore it goes each one takes, just like nevertheless, we're going to say, if you want to say it's Yerusha, and therefore, but you don't get a double portion, each one brings a carbon according to their half. Then we have another question. Do we say, so we say, we're not saying necessarily the law of the firstborn in general, but maybe in this case, we're going to say by a case of, because since it's not, when do we say the law of a double portion for firstborn? That's only where it's not sacred. But in a case where it's sacred money, we're going to say low. We're not going to say he gets a double portion. Or do we say Odelma low? Even the kanile giluach, or do we say that since the son receives the merit to bring the karbanos as a result of taking this money, there's no distinction between chulin and hektish with respect to getting a double portion. So we have a series of questions of the Gemara on basically the status of this double portion that the son gets, the status of this karbanos of the Nazir that he gets, whether it's considered a Yerusha or not. If it be a Yerusha, does the firstborn get a double portion of this money? Or do we, if we are saying it's Yerusha, first of all, we have a question whether we say it's Yerusha, it's inheritance. And even if we say it's Yerusha, do we say it's a double portion for the firstborn? The Gemara asks additional question. Aviv Nazir Olam, let's say the father is a Nazir forever, which we had said that he basically is not going to cut his hair. He's not going to cut his hair. V'hu Nazir Stam, but the son accepts upon himself a Nazir Stam, that he's going to cut his hair after 30 days. And so therefore, or Aviv Nazir Stam, V'hu Nazir Olam. And, or we say that the son is a Nazir Olam, and the father was a Nazir for 30 days. So we say under these questions, the question is, when we learn this Halacha Moshe Sinai, do we say it by a regular Nazirus, or maybe there's no distinction? Just like by a regular Nazirus, we say Halacha that the son can use the karbanos that the father set aside. Also by Nazirus Olam. So the Gemara then asks the next question. If you want to say that in both these cases, now also I know you're probably thinking, if he's a Nazir Olam, then why does he need, A, why did the father set aside money for Karbanos? And B, why would the son need to use that money for a carbon? He doesn't bring a carbon if he's in Nazir Olam. So we say no, that in Nazir Olam, when his hair gets too heavy, then he could cut his hair and bring the carbonos and then resume his Nazirus. So that's what we're talking about. And if you want to say that both of the Nazirus were that both of these cases, both the Nazirus of the father and the Nazirus of the son were both cases where he was tahar. By Rav Ashi asked another question. Aviv Nazir Tameh, let's say a father set aside money for his karbanos of Tuma, i.e. the Ola, the Chatas, and the Asham. V'hu Nazir Tahar, and the son is a Nazir Tahar, and he wants to use this money and add on to this money because he doesn't have to bring the two birds, he has to bring the animals, because most Naziris of Tuma are less than the Naziris of Tahara. Because the Nazir Tameh only brings two birds and a sheep for an Asham, whereas the Nazir Tahara brings three animals. So he wants to add on to the money and use it to bring his Karban Naziris Tahara. Or else, let's say Aviv Nazir Tahara, let's say the father was a Nazir Tahara, who Nazir Tameh, and the son wants to bring the money from it for Karbanos Tumah. What will be the law under all these cases? Maya and the Gemara says we're going to leave these questions in a teiku as unresolved. We'll turn to you, Parak Misha Amar. Okay, so we'll stop here.